Hello, and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. And thank you for joining us. I hope everyone is staying well, staying healthy, staying safe, and wearing a mask when you go outside. The topic for today is the topic everyone is talking about: the sheer power of the historic Black Lives Matter protests of the past month have forced a belated acknowledgement. Policing in America must be changed. Now, must be changed now. The question, of course, is how. We've heard calls to defund or abolish or demilitarize, but what does all that mean in practice? Our guest is especially well suited to help us understand what needs to be done, why it needs to be done, and the many challenges we'll face in getting it done. Judge LaDoris Cordell is a retired Superior Court judge, former Palo Alto City Council member, former Vice Provost of Stanford University, and that list goes on. But most germane to our discussion, Judge Cordell also served as the independent police auditor for the city of San Jose. Judge Cordell, welcome back to Other Voices.
Thank you, Paul. Glad to be here on to talk about a very important topic. So thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to join us. I'm actually going to start the question with an off-topic question, and that has to do with how busy you've been. You've been wrapping up. You're on deadline to finish writing your autobiography. When can we see the book?
Well, first of all, it's not an autobiography. It's part memoir, and it's part memoir and it's part primer. It's a primer because I think people don't really understand the world of judging, state court judges. And it's part memoir. It's about my 20 years on the bench. So I do have a book contract with a major publisher with Macmillan. And my hope is that the book will be out in 2021, sometime next year.
Okay, we have time to set up the book launch party then.
There you go.
Okay, let me actually start on the topic by just asking your own personal reactions to the events we've been seeing over the past month or so. I had on Dr. Clay Carson a couple of weeks ago, and he kept talking about the historic nature of what we're seeing. Do you share that?
I'm sure I agree with everything Professor Carson has to say. He is an expert in that area. This period of time for me has been bittersweet. It's bitter in the sense that people have had to die at the hands of police officers for this movement to really be recognized and for systemic racism to be acknowledged. And it's sweet in that it is now being acknowledged. And my hope is that this is not just a one-time occurrence, that this is really a tipping point for all institutions in this country.
Indeed, that's the hope, that it will be a major tipping point. Let's start with your experience as the independent police auditor and see what we can learn about our current situation from your experiences there. Could you just take a moment to explain very briefly what that role was and how it functioned, and what lessons you took away from it that we could apply to our situation today?
Sure. And before I do that, I just wanted to just make a comment about policing and systemic racism.
Please.
It is clear to me that there is systemic racism in policing, and it isn't just to policing. My analogy is to look at systemic racism and also the COVID-19. And I see them both in a way as viruses. They are both contagious. They both can be deadly, and they both can be asymptomatic. And that is, you have the virus, you have racist feelings, racist beliefs, but you don't know you even have them. And that's sometimes referred to as kind of implicit bias, where it's in there, things you do show that indeed this is racist conduct, but you don't really get it in your head. The big difference is that with the COVID-19, we'll find a cure, we'll get a vaccine, and it may take, I think, 4 to 5 years. If you look at just the history of finding vaccines for viruses. But for the virus of systemic racism, the cure, we have the vaccine, and the vaccine is us. It is us in doing all kinds of things. Like, for example, I see the virus in the White House right now, and the way to get rid of that part of the virus is to vote and to ensure that our votes count so that we have a different administration. And that's all part of the systemic racism. So systemic racism has had 401 years to permeate everything in this country. So from 1619 to today, this virus has had 4 centuries to get into everything, and it has. Systemic racism is everywhere, in everything, in every institution. It's in the media, it's in the courts, it's in the laws, it's in policing, it's in corporate boards, it's in the medical profession, you name it, the systemic racism virus is there. So when we get to policing, it is there, and people who don't acknowledge that, and there are a lot of police officers who don't get it, they're in denial, or they just don't want to deal with it, but will say that, no, there's no racism in our department. So it's important when we think about policing to understand there are 18,000 police departments in the United States, and each of them has its own little turf, its own jurisdiction. So there's no one big federal umbrella that can tell these 18 police departments what to do. There's some pressures that the federal government can level on some of these local police departments by withholding funds, but they can't make them do things. What institution can make them do things are the courts, and the Supreme Court, the courts that have consent decrees over police departments. So that being said, I was for 5 years the independent police auditor in the city of San Jose, which is the 10th largest city in the United States. And the job is civilian oversight, independent civilian oversight over the police. And that means different things to different cities and different police departments. There is no one form of civilian oversight over police. And actually, it's a rarity. In most of the police departments, there is no such thing. But basically, what independent oversight merely means is that when police misbehave, or allegations are made of police misconduct, civilians, you and me, members of the public, can file a complaint. And you don't have to be the victim. You can just know about it, read about something, and file a complaint.
You could
the complaints, yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so the complaints get filed with the police department, and also they can be filed with if the city has an independent police auditor filed with that office. That's what it's like in San Jose. So when the complaints come in the San Jose model, the police auditor does not investigate the complaints. The police investigate themselves. So that's problematic right off the top. So the role of oversight in San Jose was to look at the investigation done by the police to see whether or not it was objective, it was thorough, and it was fair. And if it wasn't, we could push back, but we couldn't make the police do anything. So the way we brought change in the city of San Jose with the police department was to just be very public about our concerns and about the process, and that helped bring about change. There's a recent piece, and I just saw it today, put out by CNN about independent civilian oversight and how it has not really been that effective in bringing about the change in policing. It's really worth reading, and Paul, I can send you the link to it, and maybe you can get it out. People should read it. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah,
so generally,
if you would, I'll just take this moment to remind people that when you attend here, we get your email address, and we do send out an email with resources to follow up on each program. So please do send that link, and I'll pass that on to all our attendees.
Absolutely. So anyway, that's just basically what civilian oversight is. And if the question is, well, has it really, helped policing get better? Is it, gotten them away from uses of excessive force? The answer is no. No, it has not. So to do that, we need to be talking about the culture of policing. And if you want to do that, we can do that now.
We need to, that is a major part of it. And what I wanted to ask you is, you sent me a clip of an interview you recently did on MSNBC. And one of the things that struck me, even though it was quite a short interview, But one of the things that struck me is that you talked about the stark differences between police department leadership and the rank and file and the role of the police union. And you want to talk about that? Is that part of this culture that you're talking about?
Yeah, actually, you just hit it. You hit it right on the head. So when we talk about the culture, all institutions have cultures, how they conduct themselves, how they think. Police departments are not just monolithic. There's the command staff, and that's the police chief and those who report directly to the chief, and that's just really a handful of people. And then you have the rank and file, and they're the patrol officers, usually go up to sergeants and maybe sometimes to lieutenants. And most of the police officers are the rank and file. And most police departments, not all, but most of them have a police union. And the police union represents the rank and file. And they are the police unions that really set the culture. They speak for the rank and file. So you have a culture of policing in this country that has a lot of facets to it. So one example is the military aspect of the culture of policing. It is not a military organization, it's more paramilitary in that they mimic military. They have rank and they have different kinds of things they put on their uniforms to show, how high ranking a person, an officer is or is not. When the federal government made available tanks and all kinds of military weaponry, they were chomping at the bit around the country to get all of these kinds of things because they envision themselves as a military force. And what do military do? They occupy. So policing the culture has been more militaristic. It's been more like an occupier. And what's interesting in contrast, in the military, no matter if you are the top general to the lowest level ranking, say a private, you have to stay in shape. You have to stick to a physical regimen. That's part of your responsibility. That's not required in policing. So you have that requirement when you're in the academy, which doesn't last, it's a few weeks. But after that, there's no requirement. So you can do it if you want to. So you see a lot of officers, they're not in shape. But at the same time, they don't do that. But what they spend a lot of time and what a requirement is going to the range to qualify to use their weapons. And that's a requirement. So they have to not stay in physical shape, but they have to stay in shape to be able to use their weapons. So that's part of the culture. So this culture is maintained by these police unions. So over the last decade, maybe 2 decades, unions around the country have lost their influence. And with the exception of the police unions, they've gotten stronger, they've gotten more powerful, they have money, and they influence elections and they influence legislation. And one big example of this is that California was one of the states that has the least bit of transparency in policing. So if you go to Government Code 34, Section 3400, you will see the Peace Officers' Bill of Rights, and it's legislation passed in Sacramento, and it basically says to police officers, you have all this kinds of confidentiality with regard to your records, your personnel files, and to discipline. So because they lobbied legislators who are basically afraid to stand up against the police unions, they get what I call the double standard. So double standard is that if you're a judge, if you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, if you're a psychologist, if you're bad and you are disciplined by your respective boards, that information is made public. You can get it online. So if any judge in California has been disciplined, you not only get the name of the judge, you get what the discipline was, but you also get why the judge was disciplined. The same is true for lawyers and the other professions. The only exception is police. There's a double standard. That's because they have legislation that says the public can't ever know about it. Another one is that if I'm disciplined as a judge, that stays on my record. It doesn't just get wiped away. Not so for policing. In California, those records get destroyed every, I think it's 5 or 6 years, and maybe 7. They're just wiped out. They're gone. They're gone. So you may have someone patrolling in your community that has a history of disciplinary actions, but because it was so many years back, you'll never know it. So all these double standards that have been applied to policing, and for certain in California, and it's true in other cities and other communities around the country, that's part of the culture. They've been able to get the secrecy and been able to do what it is that we do. So we're now at a point where people are standing up to the unions. And one example is the police chief in Minneapolis called off union negotiations, just said, we're not going to talk, we're not going to do any of this, I'm not even going to participate. So I'm not sure what will come of it, but what it says to me is that in your respective communities, you should know. You should read what those police contracts are. You should know where that money is going, and you should have a voice in saying whether or not those contracts should be changed or should be approved. Because right now, it's your city councils, it's your board of supervisors that approve these contracts. They negotiate with the unions, and then they approve them. So we need that information. It's available because you, the taxpayers, are paying the salaries and paying the money that supports the budgets for these police departments.
So changing those contracts when they get renegotiated could be a real key to taking out some of these protections for police who abuse their office.
But it's not that easy because they are very powerful and they sit at the bargaining table and negotiate. But what you've just suggested, Paul, goes more toward the legislation. So if the law in California was that no longer are disciplinary records concealed in private, then they couldn't put that in their contracts. So the governor of New York recently just undid a decade-long law that kept disciplinary records of police officers from the public. So there's now a new law in New York that brings transparency to that. So it's not, the negotiating has to do with money. And yes, it has to do with certain things that the union wants from the city. But the bigger issue on policing in terms of records and the destruction of records, that happens in Sacramento.
What about what you just described about your experience with the independent auditor's office, that civilian oversight and civilian review was limited, that you couldn't actually investigate a complaint? Does that come out of one of these union contracts? Is it the union that restricts these?
Okay, so good question. And Paul, that's a good question. So what happened in San Jose was that there was a community push to have independent civilian oversight over the police, and the police union pushed back. So it was the city council that got involved because they're politicians. So how do they appease the community? How do they appease the union? So they came up with this hybrid, which gave limited authority to the independent police auditor. So there is community in San Jose that's pushing to have more authority, more teeth on what the independent police auditor can do. So I'm going to give you just a quick example. So after Eric Gardner was murdered by the officers in New York, and I think it was either 2015 or 16, our office took a look at the manual. It's called a duty manual in San Jose that guides the police. So every police department has some sort of either general orders or general standards or a duty manual. In San Jose, it exceeds 600 pages, and most of these are pretty thick. And they have all the rules for what police can and can't do. So we looked at the duty manual in San Jose and said, what does it say about chokeholds? And it didn't say anything about chokeholds, which meant they could use chokeholds. Wow. And so we could have been quiet and said, well, let's just wait and something awful will happen, and then maybe we'll get a rule on chokeholds. But we didn't do that. We were proactive and said, look at what happened in New York. So our office recommended to the police a prohibition on chokeholds. And what happened? We got pushback from the union. Wow. We want to be able to do that because it's necessary and we might need to do it. So we couldn't make the police department do anything. So what we did is go make it open to the public. Let the public know that we think it should be prohibited. The union's pushing back. And so the union kind of eased off a bit. So there is now a prohibition in San Jose for the police on chokeholds. However, again, here we go, compromise politics. There is an exception for if it has to do with a life and death kind of situation for the officer, then he or she can use it. So I don't even know what that means. But so it says, don't use them, but if you have to, you can use them. Well, I mean, that's not a prohibition, but that's the best we could get. And that's another example of there's just no teeth in some of these models for independent oversight. We can't make them, have the prohibition.
So we have to start by giving them some teeth first. And that means coming up against the desires of the powerful police unions. For the sake of time,
but before you leave that, let me just give you one more example.
Sure.
There's something called the Peace Officers Research Association of California. It's California's largest law enforcement labor organization, and it represents more than 77,000 public safety workers. So that union has an initiative on the ballot. It's going to be on the ballot in November. And what they want to do with this initiative, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but you'll see that, this union supports it, it's sponsoring it. And this initiative would undo criminal justice reforms that we, the voters, put in place at the last election. Wow. So things that have to do with the early release of inmates from prison. One example is another example. So they're trying to push back on that. So one example is right now, a theft, felony, if it's going to be charged as a felony, with the law that the initiative passed, that the amount has been raised to like $950. So if you steal something worth that much, it then could be a felony. So this initiative, they want to lower it to $250. So if it's a felony and it's a strike, so this is some of the stuff that's contained in their initiative. So they have raised sufficient money and gotten signatures. And I believe I think it's on the ballot, and they've taken out full page ads. So that's, again, to give you an idea that these are very influential and very powerful for this organizations, the unions, and then this big one that is pushing to roll back some of the reforms that the voters have passed in California.
Well, thank you for the heads up on that. We will find that information, and we will include that in the resources that we mail out to our attendees. That'll probably come out tomorrow for those of you who are tuned in. Before I turn to our audience for their questions and comments, let me ask you to get your take on a couple of the broader pushes that we're hearing from what is a very diverse movement. The first one is defunding the police. And I find it an unfortunate term because it doesn't really explain what they're talking about. It's more like a redistribution of the police budget, but that doesn't fit on a bumper sticker real well. What does defunding mean to you, and what's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree with you, Paul. I agree with you. I think it's a misnomer. I see it as diverting, not defunding, but diverting funds from city budgets that fund the police departments. They get a lot of money. So you divert some of those funds and you put them other places within the city. So they could go to social services, they go to support assistance to the mentally ill, for the homeless, for housing, but taking it out. That's what I see. So there is a call for that. There is a call, and I see the hashtag reform policing, and I will tell you, I think reform is not the fix. It's the quick things that we can do to make people safer, as long as we have policing as it now is. And if I could give you one example. Sure. So there's something called Campaign Zero, and Campaign Zero has put out something called 8 Can't Wait. And it's 8 police practices that they say every department should adopt, all 18,000. And they actually, at their website, you can see what police departments, how many of those 8 have been adopted. So if you look at Palo Alto, you can see that Palo Alto has adopted some, but not all of them. Well, some police departments and some government leaders are saying, okay, that's all we got to do. So Black Lives Matter, they want policing change. What we should do, we'll make sure A Can't Wait is adopted in our police department and we're done. And my answer to that is no. And I believe that this A Can't Wait and a Campaign Zero is terrific. But I think they share my sentiment that it's being used as the quick fix and we're done. It is something that's positive. I applaud them for putting it out there, but in no way is it, the end all be all. So let me give you an example why. San Francisco Police Department has all the boxes checked. A Can't Wait. All of them, all checked off, and they've had it checked off for years. So you'd think, hey, wow, policing must be really good in San Francisco. And the answer is quite the opposite. And I know that firsthand. I was one of 3 judges who was on a blue ribbon panel and asked to look at and assess and evaluate the San Francisco Police Department. And we were asked this because of an horrendous, racist, sexist, homophobic texting scandal that involved at least 9 police officers, with some of the most egregious language being exchanged among them that was racist, homophobic, and sexist. So if 8 Can't Wait were the answer, then culture should be changed and they shouldn't feel comfortable exchanging text messages, making fun of people of color. And that's not the case. So it's good to have these things. One of them, I think, is the no chokeholds. Having more transparency. That's fine. That's for immediately. That's fine. But in my view, policing, we need to pull back and we need to completely rethink and reimagine what policing should be in the cities around the country. That's what I think we should be spending our time on. So, for example, since George Floyd's death, and I think that was May 25th, there are now 25 states that have passed 159 bills and resolutions dealing with policing, and those 24 states have totally proposed 226 bills. So forget the resolutions. They have proposed 226 bills for policing, 24 states. However, only 3 states have actually passed policing bills. So there's resolutions and there may be some quick fixes. Only 3 states. What are they? Colorado, Iowa, and New York. So there's stuff out there, things in the pipeline, and these bills deal with reforms. I believe we have to get to the culture and change that. And the only way that changes is we have to reimagine policing. It cannot continue as it is. One example is that look at Camden, New Jersey. So in Camden in 2013, the city government, and it could have been the state, decided that things were so bad in Camden and it had a tremendously high murder rate. Things were just out of control. All of the police officers, including the chief, were fired. Done. So if they wanted to be an officer in Camden, they had to reapply to a new form of policing called community policing. Now, you've heard it before. It's not rocket science. And all it means is that police officers are all out of their cars all day. On their shifts, they're out of their cars. So that means they're walking the neighborhoods. They're walking the communities. They know everybody who's at the park, who's playing basketball. They know everyone who lives in the area. They know all of the people who own the businesses. And what has happened in Camden is that before this transition, the solve rate for murders was only 16%.
Yeah.
Within 2 years of transitioning, the solve rate went to 61%. Why? Because community began to trust the people that they got to know. In other words, stereotypes were starting to be broken down on both sides. Camden is not perfect, but it's certainly far better, and they took the major step of just reimagining policing. So officers who wanted to work in Camden had to buy in to this whole new way of doing business. And those who did not reapply and went out and probably got jobs at other police departments. So I want us, everybody, if you care about this issue, to be about the business of reimagining policing. It is possible, it's doable. You just have to think outside the box. And we have to have community put sufficient pressure on our city councils or board of supervisors, because if and they'll be reluctant, there's going to be pushback. Systems are resistant to change, but community can make this happen. And if they, city government people, aren't on board, then they need to leave office, and we need to elect people who will actually have the courage to go ahead and make these things happen. And we need to push back on unions. And the unions, I think, now are running scared. Police unions are, because they're seeing that people are calling them out. And yet, when George Floyd was killed, the police union defended. Now, he was murdered right on camera. I mean, there's no ways around that one. No, in my view, there is not. But the police union came right to the defense of the officers, saying, it was justified. This is the culture, the circle of wagons, and other cultures have this. Judges, lawyers, there's this circle of the wagon mentality. But police are different. They have weapons, they have badges, and they have authority to put their hands on you and take liberty under the color of law. So one other enabler we have of this police culture are the courts. So you have the U.S. Supreme Court that has rendered decisions like Graham versus Connor, that was 1989, that says, if you want to sue a police officer for using force, the standard of proof is that the officers, you have to consider the use of force from the officer's viewpoint at that moment. If the officer at that moment perceived that the use of force was appropriate, that's how you have to look at it. That's the instruction that's given to jurors. So there's no instruction that says you get to look at whether or not the officer provoked this person into doing something that then culminated in the use of force. Provocation. What was the officer's conduct before that? So, the courts have issued rulings that favor law enforcement. And for example, the Supreme Court decided not even to hear the case that came to them on qualified immunity. And what qualified immunity is, it's a legal term, a legal principle that limits the liability of government officials, including police officers. The court had an opportunity to take it up, and they declined to even hear it. So there is qualified immunity. So in my view, it may be the federal courts are a lost cause, and we need to look to our state courts to step up. We need to look at our judges to step up and have the courage to make decisions that are objectively looking at what it is police do. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying courts should always just rule against police. That's not what I'm saying. But right now, decisions are such that it is very difficult to hold an officer liable. And prosecutors, they're the ones that can bring charges. How often do prosecutors charge officers and declare that their conduct is criminal? Very, very rarely. Why? Because the police and prosecutors work together. They do. The police arrest people, and then they file their police reports. They take them right over to the prosecutors, who then file. So there's so many issues, and the underpinning, I believe, is still the systemic racism that has led us to where we are now.
And that very powerful opening statement you said about the viral nature of systemic racism. Let's bring our audience in on this. Folks, if you're participating in one of these for the first time, you'll see somewhere on your screen a little raise hand signal. And if you click on that, we'll know that you have a question. And then you'll get a message that you're being made into a panelist, and your Zoom window will actually disappear very briefly and come back on, and you'll be a panelist. When your screen comes back on, you will need to start your video camera so that we can see you to ask your question. And I'm going to take a look at the list here. And the first one is an email address. So we'll start with Gem Home Office. to be followed by Heidi Cooper. And while we're getting those folks online, let me ask you just quickly about one of the ideas that I've read about is it was termed decriminalizing. And I think we learned a lot about how this works from the Ferguson situation. So many city budgets, like Ferguson, relied on doling out fines for very minor infractions to citizens of their city. They couldn't pay the fines, and we get more fines, and it goes on like that. Are there ways we can decriminalize a lot of behavior that would benefit and help in this situation?
So Paul, what you just raised is a problem that really came about with the courts. Judges were, chomping at the bit to impose fines on folks, and poor people.
I have to apologize. My answering machine is going off in the background. I forgot all about the phone. I'm sorry. Please.
No problem. Sure. So that issue is really a problem that was implemented, by the courts, where judges were imposing fines and raising money for the city or the city government's coffers, and that's just outrageous. So once attention was focused on it, then you see again, sunshine is the best disinfectant. Once people started seeing from the outside what was going on, that behavior is starting to change. But they were able to impose these fines because of so many crimes that are on the books. So, I say to folks here in California, look at the penal code, and the vehicle code, and you'll be stunned by how many crimes there are, from infractions to misdemeanors to felonies. And we criminalize, there's so much that's criminalized. So that's part of the problem. So when we talk about decriminalizing, I really think it's our state legislators need to take a look at the penal code and look at why we criminalize standing on a street corner. It's called loitering. So, an officer, I'm going to arrest you for loitering because why are we doing this? So again, I get back to, the underpinnings of where laws like this might have been well-intentioned, but they might have been generated to keep poor people, people of color, to really go after them, to keep them from, congregating, to keep Black people from, being together. Who knows? But my point is there are laws that it would take a wonderful project for a law student or somebody who was an intern and a legislative intern. Look at the penal code, and we need to get some of these laws off the books. They should not be criminalized. And that's kind of a major overhaul. And every year, legislators propose more and more laws to commit for crimes. And I just think we're just going totally overboard and need to pull all that back.
Yeah, an effective side effect, or the major effect of law and order as a campaign tactic and being tough on crime. So let's turn to our first audience member here. I can see now that he's on screen, John Miller. John, thanks for joining us. And we'll next be going to Heidi Cooper and then Whitney Paulbaum after that. So John, please, what's your question?
My question is this. A group in my church is debating what our response should be as a church. There's a group that says, well, we should take the easy, low-hanging fruit. That is, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 of the 8 can't wait provisions. Another group says, at least we should go that far. I'm hearing you say, no, you shouldn't do that because the issues that we need to deal with are so much bigger. As you know, I have great respect for your opinion, having served, presented cases in your court for years.
Right.
So I'm really interested in your answer.
Okay.
Thank you, John. Thank you. So I have not saying, and I don't want to be misunderstood here, that A Can't Wait should not be implemented. They are important. It's good as long as we keep the policing model that we have now, that they should be implemented. So I hope that you and your church members will look at what your police departments or departments have with regard to the 8, and absolutely, I think, push to get those adopted. So the second one goes, as I said, that really doesn't get to kind of the core, the culture of policing. So to change that, it's really going to take more thought. It's going to take a willingness for leadership in your cities to understand that there's more that's going on with policing than just saying no chokeholds. So I say it's both. I think that you should undertake immediately the A Can't Wait. And then once that's done, I think you all should pat yourselves on the back, because that's a major thing to get done. And then I think your church members should look at each other and say, now what is next? What should we do? And it could be, for example, in your communities, I don't know if, what the Black population is, or if you're near communities of color. It's really to find out what is happening in those communities, because maybe you're not aware that there are some other issues that are going on that have not come to your attention. So a lot of this is, the key to changing anything, John, is knowledge. It's getting information. It's really understanding what it is you're dealing with before you jump in and decide you want to change it. So it's really understanding your police departments, who the leaders are, what does the contract look like, what's the budget, really getting it, and then talking to people who have perhaps been victims of excessive force or being disrespected by the police, getting their stories, and then figuring with them maybe, to come up with some other things that we can do as we begin to reimagine and rethink what policing should be in our communities.
Yeah, excellent question. One thing, while John was asking the question you were answering, that struck me as a good idea for people working locally, came up here in my town, because right next door in Mountain View, it was pointed out that the police department there posts on their website demographic information from all the stops that they make. This is important information to collect, so we know if there's some kind of problem, incipient problem in our local force. And it was pointed out that where I live, Los Altos, they don't do anything like that. That might be something worth pursuing, whatever town you're in, is make them collect that information.
So Paul, so here's the deal. It is a requirement of all law enforcement agencies in the state of California to report that data annually to the state attorney general's office. So Californians passed a law that requires this to be done, and I believe the law went into effect January 1st, 2019. Every law enforcement agency, they must give the race, the gender, the age of every person they stop, detain, arrest, and it could be a pedestrian stop or vehicle stop, the reason why they stopped the person, whether or not the person was searched, whether or not anything came out of the search, and what was the result of the stop. Was the person let go? Was the person arrested? That is required. And what the law did is it phases in. It starts with the larger police departments first. And if you look at this law, it even says if there's so many officers, or it may be done by the size of the city, they are to start first, but everyone gets phased in. So if Los Altos or whatever, they're not getting this data together, I suggest look at the law, and then somebody needs to go put a bug in their ear that this is a requirement. It has to be made public, and it goes up to the AG's office as well. And the AG is supposed to present an annual report to all Californians about all of this. So it's all the stop data, arrest data, everything has to be reported now. That is the law of California.
So check out what your own locality is doing about making this information public, and maybe activists can work on making it public. So Lynn Heidi Cooper has joined us on screen here. What's your question, Lynn, and welcome.
Thank you. This is a fabulous program. I wish everybody in California could see it. Two things. One, I just remember the cop that killed the Vietnamese lady who was mentally ill that had a vegetable peeler and he shot her. Were you the IPA when that case occurred? Because he got off, as I recall. And then there was a cop recently in a demonstration recently where the man was injured with eye socket. He was going to lose his sight. The other question I have, which is, I think, a great development, is sending out mental health professionals to situations, domestic abuse, I guess, whatever. And because I think that the blue uniform with guns automatically triggers, especially people of color, to be agitated, and then things turn out badly. So what do you think about, and do you think San Jose is going to adopt the mental health professional response?
Okay, thank you. All good questions. Let me go back to the first one. There was a mentally ill Vietnamese woman who the police were called because that's what the resource was then. I don't know if I was the IPA then, but I remember the incident, and it may have occurred before I started. I was the IPA from 2010 to 2015. So in that incident, there was no criminal prosecution of the officer. His use of force was deemed to be justified, clearly, because he was not criminally prosecuted. And the police, because in San Jose, the police investigate the police and then decide whether or not an officer should be disciplined, the officer's conduct was deemed justifiable. So there you go. So that brings up, I'm going to jump to your question at the end about having, instead of calling the police, calling individuals who are trained to deal with the mentally ill to go respond. So that the police are the backup only if there's, a violence, some sort of violence. So they're trained to deal with that, but they should not be the first responders, in my view. And so whether or not San Jose, the city council and the mayor are going to move in that direction, I hope they will. I think they are. Let me tell you, every police department also has something called crisis intervention training. And believe it or not, that's what they had in San Jose when we had these shootings. And in Palo Alto, a mentally ill man had a butter knife, something like a butter knife, and he came out of his house, and he is no longer with us. And there was no criminal prosecution either. So once again, we get to culture, we get to people who are really not, even if they say they have crisis intervention training, it's not playing out when these incidents kind of take off. So I think I've addressed your questions.
Yeah, that sounded good. Okay, let's turn now to Whitney, who has joined us. Whitney, thanks for joining us. What's your question?
Hi, Your Honor. I have two questions, but I'm going to reverse the order on them because it kind of has to do with your last one. I've managed to help set up a meeting with our city council member, Raul. We live in Nagley Park, so it's downtown San Jose. The city council has continued to respond to us when we ask for moving funds from the San Jose Police Department to some sort of social services like mental health or helping the homeless, that they can't do that because that's the county's jurisdiction. They said that unlike LA and San Francisco, we're not both a county and a city, so it's impossible to use city funds for social services when that's the county's duty. So first question on that is, what can we ask in this upcoming meeting from the city council in terms of how to either fix that bridge or hold them accountable for that? The second one is, how can we ask them to stand up to the police unions?
All right, so let's take your first question. So people should understand there's law enforcement for the county, and that's the sheriff. And then there's law enforcement for individual cities within the county. So the cities have their own budgets, and then the county has its budget. The sheriff's department has jurisdiction where city police do not. And some cities contract with the sheriff's department to have the sheriff's department do law enforcement in their cities. So that's basically, again, trying to get a basic understanding of how it works. So I understand, Whitney, what you've said, and that the city says we can't take city money because that's city, that's raised from residents, people who work in the city, they pay their taxes, and then give it over to the county. And that's accurate as far as I understand. That is accurate. They cannot do that. So the question really becomes, what resources, two things, what resources are there in the city of San Jose to address the mentally ill? I cannot believe that there are no organizations that exist in the city that have the sufficient expertise to assist or to help out in dealing with the mentally ill. If they're not, that's a huge problem, and something needs to be created to be in the city so that the funds could be diverted. I just have a hard time believing it's not. So the other is that you go to the county because you live in Santa Clara County or work in Santa Clara County, to the Board of Supervisors and say, you have a budget, take some money out from sheriff's law enforcement, but the budget, and direct it into the mental health within the county. So there's a way you'd have to kind of, deal with each probably independently. Your last question, and I'm blanking on what it was. Whitney, can you tell me again?
I think Whitney is.
It was about what the city. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
About confronting the police union.
The union. So Whitney, I say good luck with that. It's a real tough one because they have this contract where they sit down and negotiate with the city council and the mayor, and the city manager. So it's really the community, the people have to say to the elected officials, no more. And you have to be familiar with all of what's in the contract and what they're proposing. And most of us don't. Most of us don't take the time to look at the contract, and you have a right to look at it and to see it, and to then look at specific items and to push back, call your city council members and ask them why they are not speaking out, or push them to speak out on these issues. This is going to be a real tough one. So until policing is dramatically changed in San Jose or in any of these other places, the unions are going to be a big issue. And I will tell you, I have never seen a police union that welcomed the police reforms. They always push back. So it's the culture, and the culture says, we're law enforcement, we know what's best. Why are you outsiders, you civilians? You don't know what we do. You didn't go through the academy. You're not trained. You shouldn't be telling us how we should be handling ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of the mindset for at least those, who speak for the union and push forward. They're not ready, and they are not eager to adopt these reforms. So it takes a lot of pushing, and that's been my experience. San Francisco has been my experience, in San Jose, and I think that's pretty typical.
Okay, well, thank you for a couple of excellent questions, Whitney, and also thank you for taking action in your own community to see what you can do about this. We've now been joined by another member of our audience, Gail Price. Welcome. Thank you for participating. What's your question, Gail?
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the discussion. And I have a question. I'd like your thoughts on this, LaDoris. Some people who very much recognize the need for police reform simultaneously wonder how these changes will improve the safety and protection for all communities and all individuals. In a culture without effective gun control and not sufficient protections from police who misuse guns occasionally.
Judge
Thank
Cordell?
you, Gail. Thank you. So you've hit an issue that is a big one, and that's guns. So we are a country that has gone gun crazy. and we have a Supreme Court. And when I say a Supreme Court, I don't mean all of them, because there are liberal members of the courts who tend to be, in my view, given my perspective, right on all the issues, correct on them. So the majority of the court, I believe, egregiously has misinterpreted the Second Amendment to say that, you know, we can arm ourselves and have as many guns generally as you want. So, Gail, we're dealing with a mentality just generally in communities that think guns are wonderful and people should have them. Now, if you're now talking about what are we going to do to kind of rein in the use of guns by police officers, they have their trainings, they go to these academies, and they're taught to use their weapons. They regularly go back to make sure they can use them and use them accurately. So I don't know that we can do much at all other than, one, react when those weapons are used in a way that we believe are use of excessive force, and understand that today in policing, they have the right, the authority to carry weapons, to use them, and when they believe it is appropriate to use them. Now in California, the rule used to be that officers could use their weapons and use deadly force when they believed it was reasonable to do so. That has been changed in California to necessary. So they can use necessary, excessive force. You can use lethal force or just use of force only now if it is deemed to be necessary. Again, necessary may be in the eye of the beholder. So I'm not sure that I can really answer your question, because it really goes to, once again, the culture of policing. We know there have been incidents in Palo Alto where police officers on camera have used excessive force and in doing so used homophobic language. And one officer in particular where this happened, and I saw the video, I've commented about it publicly. Oh, he's no longer with the police department, but he was allowed to resign and keep his pension. What is that? What message does that send? And there is nothing stopping him from going to another police department and getting hired, because officers that don't get decertified in California, meaning you engage in bad behavior, we take away your ability to be a cop, we decertify you. That doesn't happen in California. It happens in some states, but not in California. So here we go. We have a culture that basically says you've used excessive force, you've beat somebody terribly, or you've shot somebody. So here's what we're going to do. And this is city government too. We'll let you resign, keep your pension, just go away. That doesn't solve the problem. I think it's outrageous. So all I can say, Gail, is we have a lot of work to do.
And thank you again, Gail, for the question. And I think that's a good place to wrap it up. We do have to keep track of our time here, because even though this is Zoom, the local Mid-Penn Media Center continues to broadcast these shows on local television, so more people will get to see it. The video will be on YouTube and on the Peace and Justice Center's website. Judge LaDoris, Cordell, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I know I've learned a lot. I think everybody else has learned a lot too.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. And I just commend the Peninsula Peace and Justice Center for the good work you always do. You all are proactive. You don't sit around and wait for somebody to ask you to do something. So I'm more than glad to participate. Thank you for all of those who support the center. Keep supporting the center, both morally and financially, and let us go forward. To be silent, to do nothing, is to be complicit, and none of us must do that. So let's move onward, let's stay hopeful, and let's all do our part. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, Judge LaDoris Cordell. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Check out Judge Cordell's website. Take a look at my blog. I'd love to have your questions or comments. I forgot to put my email address on the screen, paul@peaceandjustice.org. Program suggestions, comments on the online version of other voices. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for joining us. Stay safe, stay well, everyone. Bye-bye.